The Christmas my parents gave my sister a $4.300 Gucci bag while handing me nothing but a $2 greeting card. Was the year everything changed? What was supposed to be a holiday of joy turned into the moment I finally spoke out, and what followed reshaped my family forever. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I still remember the sound of the wrapping paper tearing. My sister's manicured nails sliced through the silver foil like she was unwrapping destiny itself. All eyes in the living room were on her, and that's exactly the way she liked it. Inside the box was a glossy white dust bag, stamped with the unmistakable double G emblem. She let out a gasp so rehearsed it could have been for a commercial. With exaggerated slowness, she pulled out a Gucci handbag, sleek black leather, gold chain strap, the kind of accessory you see in magazines where the models don't bother smiling. "Oh my God," she squealed, her voice dripping with triumph. She swung it over her shoulder like she was born into royalty. The room erupted in claps and laughter. My parents beamed as though they had just single-handedly secured her future. My mother actually dabbed her eyes, muttering about how her baby girl deserved only the best. My father chuckled and nudged my uncle, proud of this grand display of generosity. I smiled politely, but inside, a familiar heaviness settled in my chest. It was the same heaviness I had carried for years, sitting quietly, watching favoritism dressed up as love. Then it was my turn. My mother reached into the pile and picked up a thin white envelope. She handed it to me with none of the grandeur she had shown my sister. "Here, sweetheart," she said, almost absent-mindedly, as though she was passing me a receipt. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out a folded greeting card. On the front, "To Snowman" smiled stiffly beside a pine tree. I opened it to find 3 words scrawled inside: "Merry Christmas, love Mom and Dad." No gift card tucked inside. No cash. Not even a thoughtful handwritten note, just that. I blinked at the card, waiting for more. Maybe they had hidden something in the tree. Maybe there was some kind of joke. But my parents had already turned their attention back to my sister, who was parading her new bag around the living room like it was a crown. A $2 card. That was my gift. I sat very still, holding the card in my lap. My hands trembled slightly, though I clenched my fingers to stop it. Around me, the conversation swirled, everyone fussing over my sister, snapping photos, pouring drinks, but it felt like a glass wall had gone up between us. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but instead, a cold knot formed in my stomach. And then came the words that shattered whatever was left of my composure. My father, half distracted, looked over at me and said, "You don't care about things like this anyway, right?" The room carried on as though nothing had happened. But in that single sentence, years of favoritism were confirmed. I wasn't overlooked by accident. I wasn't forgotten. I was dismissed, labeled the one who didn't matter enough for effort. I looked down at the card again. Its cheap glossy paper reflecting the twinkling Christmas lights. My sister's laughter rang out from across the room, sharp and triumphant. And in that moment, something deep inside me shifted. This wasn't just about a bag, or even about the card. This was about being invisible in my own family. And I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. When I say that moment wasn't about a bag, I mean it. That Gucci purse was just the latest symbol of a pattern I had known my whole life. I grew up as the older of 2 daughters. From the outside, we looked like a normal family. My father worked long hours in finance. My mother kept the household running. And my sister and I were raised in what most people would call a comfortable, middle-class home. But appearances can be deceiving, and in our home, love was not distributed evenly. From the time we were children, my sister was the one who sparkled in my parents' eyes. She was the baby, the one my mother coddled endlessly. She had a way of whining until she got what she wanted, and my parents always obliged. If she wanted a new toy, they bought it. If she wanted to quit piano lessons, they excused it. If she threw a tantrum, they smoothed it over. Meanwhile, I was the steady one. I was the child who kept my head down, who finished my chores without reminders, who made sure homework was done before dinner. I was the easy child, the one they didn't have to worry about. At least, that's what they told me. "You're so responsible," my mother would say, almost like it was a compliment and a dismissal in one breath. My father used to tell me, "You'll make it on your own. You don't need us the way your sister does." At the time, I believed them. I thought maybe being overlooked was a kind of backhanded compliment, proof that I was independent. But as I got older, I started to notice what independent really meant in their language. It meant they didn't feel obligated to invest in me the way they did with her. The warning signs were always there. Birthdays, for example. Mine were usually quiet affairs, cake at home, maybe a sweater or a book. My sister's birthdays, on the other hand, were full productions. Catered parties, piles of gifts, expensive clothes she would discard within months. I remember once, at 14, I asked my parents why she had a rented party bus for her sweet 16. When I had barely gotten a family dinner, my father chuckled and said, "Well, she's more social than you. You wouldn't have enjoyed a big party anyway." School events followed the same pattern. When I won a writing competition, my mother congratulated me briefly but then said, "Don't brag too much. It'll make your sister feel bad." But when my sister was cast in a minor school play, my parents invited relatives, bought her flowers, and treated it like Broadway, and then there was money. By the time I was in high school, I noticed how quick they were to open their wallets for her but not for me. She got designer sneakers, new phones, and vacations with friends. I was told to be practical, to save, to not expect so much. "We're teaching you responsibility," my father said once when I asked for help with a school trip abroad. That's how the roles were cast. My sister, the adored princess. Me, the dependable workhorse. I don't want to give the impression that I resented her entirely back then. In some ways, I even played into the role willingly. I studied hard, worked part-time jobs, and took pride in paying my own way. But underneath that pride was a quieter ache, the ache of realizing that my efforts were invisible to the people whose approval should have mattered most. My sister, meanwhile, thrived on the attention. She was entitled, smug, and utterly unashamed of it. She would wave her new phone in my face, laugh about how mom just couldn't say no to her, and brag about things she hadn't earned. Sometimes I wondered if she even noticed the difference in how we were treated, or if she simply enjoyed it too much to care. Still, despite all of that, I tried to keep the peace. I convinced myself that the imbalance wasn't worth a fight. Holidays, birthdays, everyday life, I bit my tongue, smiled, and told myself it didn't matter. But deep down, I knew it did. And when Christmas came around that year, I already had a sinking feeling. The holidays in our family were always tilted, but I thought maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Maybe they would surprise me with something thoughtful, even if it wasn't expensive. What I didn't realize then was that this Christmas wasn't going to be just another disappointment. It was going to be the breaking point. Asterisk the Christmas of the Gucci bag wasn't my first taste of favoritism, but it was the first time it felt like my parents had drawn a bright red line and dared me to notice. As I sat there, holding that flimsy card in my lap, my father's words echoed in my mind. "You don't care about things like this anyway, right?" It was said so casually, like a joke tossed into the air, but it landed on me like a hammer blow, because in that single moment, he told me exactly how they saw me. The daughter who didn't deserve celebration. The daughter who could be brushed aside because she would never complain loudly enough to make them uncomfortable. I stared down at the card. The cheap ink smudged where my mother's pen must have dragged. The contrast between that folded paper and the glossy black leather gleaming in my sister's lap was almost comical. One cost a fortune, the other barely more than pocket change. But it wasn't about the money, it was about effort, about recognition, about the feeling that I mattered. I shifted slightly in my chair, forcing a smile as relatives continued to crowd around my sister. She was laughing, posing with the bag, already talking about which outfits she'd pair it with. The whole performance was theater, and my parents played their roles to perfection, proud benefactors, doting guardians. The picture of generosity, and me? I was the silent extra in the corner. For years, I had rationalized their favoritism. Maybe they thought I was stronger. Maybe they were teaching me to be independent. Maybe, in their own twisted way, they thought they were being fair. The knot in my stomach tightened. My jaw ached from holding my smile in place. My palms felt damp against the slick cardstock of the greeting card. I wanted to disappear, but at the same time, I wanted to stand up and shout the truth that this wasn't fair, that it never had been fair. But I didn't shout. Not yet. Instead, I sat in silence, absorbing every detail. My mother's proud tears, my father's smug grin, my sister's smug delight. The way the relatives politely ignored the disparity. I burned it into my memory, because somewhere deep inside me, I knew this was no longer something I could shrug off. This was the moment the line had been crossed. Because favoritism is one thing, neglect is another. But handing your eldest child a $2 card in front of a room full of people while celebrating your youngest with thousands of dollars in luxury, that was something else entirely. That was humiliation, and humiliation has a way of planting seeds. As I looked at my sister showing off her new prize, I realized this would not end here. Not for me. Not this time. Asterisk if that card had been the end of it. Maybe I could have tucked the memory away with the others, another small wound. Another private reminder that I was the invisible child. But humiliation rarely comes alone. In my family, it never did. It started with my sister, of course. She never missed an opportunity to twist the knife. After unwrapping her Gucci treasure, she strolled across the room and leaned over to peer at the card in my lap. "Cute," she said with a grin that wasn't kind. "Guess they know who the favorite is." Her voice was syrupy sweet, but her eyes glittered with triumph. Then she turned on her heel and swung the bag against her hip as if it were a trophy. Everyone laughed politely, but no one spoke up, not even to pretend to soften the jab. My parents smiled indulgently, as if her cruelty was just part of her charm. The evening wore on like that. My sister basked in the limelight, and my parents fanned the flames. When relatives questioned the extravagance of the gifts, someone even joked about whether my parents had robbed a bank. My father waved it off. "She deserves nice things," he said, clapping a hand on her shoulder. Then he added, with a glance toward me, "Her sister's more serious. She doesn't need all this nonsense." It was the kind of comment that might sound harmless to an outsider, but to me, It was a public declaration that I wasn't worth celebrating, that the very things I had been praised for, my responsibility, my seriousness, were the reasons I would always be passed over. Later that night, the cruelty stretched beyond the walls of our living room. My sister posted a series of photos online, showcasing the bag from every angle. The captions were little barbs, disguised as jokes. One read, "Best Christmas ever, guess it pays to be loved." She tagged me in it, knowing full well who her target was. The notifications buzzed on my phone, each one another jab. Friends from school, co-workers, distant cousins, they all saw it. Some messaged me privately, asking if I was okay, but most just liked the post and moved on. For them, it was entertainment. For me, it was exposure. Still, I tried to keep my composure. I told myself I could endure it the way I always had, quietly, without making waves. But my sister wasn't done at dinner. She picked at her food with one hand while resting the Gucci bag in her lap like a pet. Every few minutes, she'd toss out a little dig. Maybe if you smiled more, they'd buy you something nice. Or, you're just not the type for luxury. Are you? Each comment was met with laughter, a chuckle from my father, or an affectionate shake of the head from my mother. The message was clear. Her cruelty was entertainment, and I was the unwilling punchline. With every remark, the weight on my chest grew heavier. I had endured this dynamic for years, always the afterthought, always the scapegoat, but this time, something was shifting inside me. My patience was fraying. My silence no longer felt like strength, and though I didn't realize it at the time, their indulgence of her cruelty was exactly what would set the stage for their downfall. By the time dinner rolled around, my nerves were stretched thin like fraying wire. I sat quietly at the long oak table, the same table where I had eaten countless family meals over the years. The room glowed with warm candlelight, the air thick with the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon. From the outside, it looked like a picture-perfect holiday gathering, but beneath the surface, it felt like I was suffocating. My sister sat across from me, her new Gucci bag nestled proudly in her lap like a sacred relic. Every so often, she would lift the flap, peek inside, and smile to herself, as though it held not just her belongings but her very sense of worth. My parents' faces lit up each time they looked at her, their voices soft and full of admiration. When they turned to me, their tone shifted, polite, perfunctory, nothing more. I tried to focus on my plate, cutting my food into neat pieces, chewing slowly, pretending to be absorbed in the meal. But their words floated around me, each one another reminder of where I stood in their hierarchy. At some point, the conversation turned to gifts. Relatives asked what everyone had received, and my sister leapt at the opportunity to boast. She held up her bag for all to see, recounting in great detail how Mom and Dad just knew I had to have this one, because only the best would do. There was laughter, clapping, even a toast raised in her honor. My father looked at me then, grinning, and said, "And our other daughter doesn't need flashy gifts. She's the practical one." It was meant as a compliment, I think, but in that moment, it felt like a slap. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I could feel my throat tightening, the back of my neck burning hot. I wanted to scream, to ask why my practicality meant I deserved nothing but a cheap card. But I stayed silent, chewing on my anger like it was another course of the meal. And then my sister delivered the final blow. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, and looked straight at me. Her lips curved into that familiar, infuriating smirk. "Maybe if you were more fun, they'd spend money on you." The words dropped into the silence between courses, sharp as glass. For a moment, No one spoke. Then my parents actually laughed at her cruelty. My mother shook her head fondly and said, "Oh, don't tease your sister." But her tone wasn't corrective. It was indulgent, almost proud. I sat frozen, my fork suspended in midair. My heart pounded against my ribs, loud enough I was sure someone else could hear it. A coldness spread through me, starting in my chest and radiating outward until even my fingers felt numb. That was it. That was the moment I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep playing the part of the dutiful daughter who swallowed every slight. My silence had protected no one, not me. Not even the fragile illusion of family harmony my parents clung to. As I lowered my fork to the plate, a strange calm washed over me. It wasn't rage, not anymore. It was clarity, a sharp, focused clarity that told me something had to change. And I was the only one who could change it. I didn't speak that night. Not yet. But in the quiet hours after dinner, as the laughter faded and the house grew still, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom and replayed every word, every smirk, every dismissive glance. And in that silence, I realized I had finally reached my breaking point. The line had been crossed. The scales had tipped. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let it slide. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows of the old chandelier stretching like long fingers across the walls. My mind replayed the evening again and again, the laughter, the dismissive words, the smirk that seemed to define my entire childhood. Every time I thought I'd drift off, another surge of heat rose in my chest, pulling me back into wakefulness. But somewhere between anger and exhaustion, something shifted. I stopped rehearsing what I wished I'd said and started asking myself a different question. What can I actually do? That's when the memories came flooding back. I remembered the times my father had asked me to help him sort through paperwork because, unlike my sister, I paid attention to details. I remembered the afternoons my mother called me into her study to review letters, bills, even legal documents, because she didn't want to bother with the fine print. And most of all, the plan wasn't fully formed yet, but the seed had been planted. I would no longer beg for scraps of love or recognition. If my family insisted on treating me as expendable, I would remind them in the most undeniable way possible that I was the one holding their world together. That realization filled me with an energy I hadn't felt in years. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and reached for the notebook on my nightstand. I began scribbling everything I remembered: account numbers, property addresses, the names of business partners. I wrote until my hand ached, until the ink smeared beneath my fingers by the time dawn broke, painting the walls with pale light. I wasn't just the forgotten daughter anymore. I was the keeper of their secrets. And I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I was going to use them. I didn't want spectacle. I wanted clarity. I wanted the truth to land like a solid thing on the table, not an accusation hurled in heat, but evidence laid out where everyone could see it and understand it without my voice turning into anger. That was part of the plan. Keep my hands steady, my tone measured, and let the facts do the work. The preparation felt like folding oneself into armor. Over the next week, I moved methodically, the way I used to when I organized our family files. I made copies, neat, professional copies, of bank statements and account summaries I'd pulled together from years of watching, of helping, of tidying their paperwork when they asked. I highlighted dates and transactions where money unexpectedly vanished from accounts that had been earmarked for my future. I printed a spreadsheet showing transfers labeled as family expenses and large withdrawals timed the same week my sister had received expensive gifts. I even included a scanned copy of an old email where my father casually suggested shifting funds between accounts to cover upcoming purchases. It felt strange to turn private documents into a public display. For years, those pages had represented trust, the trust my parents put in me to file, to archive, to make sense of numbers. Now the same pages were my shield. I practiced what I would say, not rehearsing a monologue, but framing it so that if my voice caught, the documents would speak. I imagined the room, the faces, the small gasps turning into murmurs. I imagined my sister's expression, the way smugness might curdle into confusion. I imagined my parents trying to find a place to hide, and finding only paper and their own handwriting. The night I chose was not random. My parents had invited the extended family over under the usual pretext: a New Year get-together, a chance to show off the holidays one last time. People would be relaxed, complacent, and that was the safest time for the truth to land hard. I wanted witnesses, because witnesses transform private slights into communal accountability. I arrived with a slim manila folder tucked under my arm, the kind of folder I used at work when I had something important to present. My hands were steady as I walked into the living room, the familiar hum of small talk filling the air. My sister greeted me with a bright, practiced grin, her Gucci bag slung dutifully over one shoulder. My mother fussed with a tray of snacks, cheeks flushed, proud as ever. My father clapped someone on the back and told the same old stories. The house smelled like citrus and cinnamon, and the calm that comes when adults pretend everything is fine. I set the folder on the coffee table and pretended to be casual. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice. The smallness of the folder made it easier for them to dismiss it. But that was part of the calculation. People least expect a quiet thing to hold thunder. We talked for a while, the conversation skimming the surface. I laughed at a cousin's joke, nodded at a friend's anecdote. All the while my eyes flicked to the family cluster. I watched how my parents' faces softened when they looked at my sister, how their body language angled toward her. I watched the way relatives' eyes followed the bag, admiring it, and then the way none of them looked at me with the same curiosity. When the chatter lulled and everyone settled into a circle, I cleared my throat. It was a small sound, but it was enough to pull attention toward me. "There's something I need to talk about," I said. My voice was quiet, calm, no tremor. "It's important." A few heads turned, smiles still in place. My mother asked, "Is everything okay?" As if the question itself could smooth any wrinkle. My father offered a reassuring look. My sister, sensing an interruption to her limelight, arched an eyebrow. "Are you sure this can wait?" she asked, voice laced with impatience. "It can't," I said. I folded my hands on the folder and tapped it once. "I brought something you should see." I opened the folder and drew out the first printout. A bank statement with a column of highlighted withdrawals. I did not raise my voice, but I did speak deliberately, because deliberate words are hard to ignore. "This account," I said, sliding the sheet toward the center of the coffee table, "is the one Mom and Dad set aside for my education. It has a clear purpose and a clear name on the ledger. Over the past year, there have been multiple transfers out of this account. Some are labeled family expenses. Some are large, unexplained withdrawals." I watched the room shrink inward. My mother's smile fluttered. My father's jaw tightened, but his eyes were still trying to find the tone of a joke. "I must have the wrong account," he said, forcing lightness. "This is ridiculous." I let him flounder. I pulled out another sheet. A succinct spreadsheet I'd made that aligned each withdrawal with a date and a description of purchases. On November 20th, I read, A transfer of $4,300 was made from this account. On that same day, a payment to luxury goods cleared in the amount, matching the listed purchase price of the handbag that was given at Christmas. I slid the line items across so they were impossible to miss. Silence arrived like a physical weight. Someone's silverware chimed in the kitchen. A cousin's breath made a soft little noise. My sister's face paled as she looked from the paper to the purse and back again. For the first time that night, her smile faltered. She reached for the bag almost as if she were protecting it. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. "That can't be right," she whispered. She looked at my father, eyes wide with something I'd never seen. Not shame, exactly, but the quick flicker of worry that happens when there is suddenly something to hide. My father's voice rose, an octave higher than his usual calm. "Where did you get those?" he demanded, but his anger was more show than substance. It came out sharp because he was scrambling for cover, for an explanation that didn't involve the truth. "I'm the one who has access to those statements," I said. "I've been helping with the paperwork for years. I know where the money is supposed to be, and I know where it went." I didn't shout. I didn't need to. The papers were doing the work for me. They were there, in black and white, with our family's handwriting and bank abbreviations. No one could unsee them, my sister stammered. I didn't know." The sentence dissolved into a whisper that sounded less like innocence and more like a pleading defense. She clutched the bag tighter, the leather creased between her fingers, as though she could hold the truth in place by sheer force of will. Relatives murmured. Questions blossomed and collided. "Is this true? How could this happen? Did you ask them?" My father began to speak, offering half excuses. The sort of phrases people use when trying to stitch together a coherent lie on the fly. "It was an emergency. We moved the funds for a family need." His words were soft and messy at once, and in the hush they sounded thin. I reached for another sheet. An email excerpt where he had suggested moving funds around, written months before. "You told the family accountant this would be temporary," I said. "Temporary doesn't explain an entire fund being used to buy presents for one child." My mother's face, which had been composed in public for decades, crumpled. For a moment she looked younger than she had in years, smaller, not proud, not indignant, simply human and caught. She muttered something defensive, then stopped. Her hands shook, and she looked away. The room had transformed. The solidarity that my parents had relied on, the silent pact that criticism didn't belong in public, was fractured. People who had applauded my sister's glamour were now looking at the bag with a new lens. What had been a symbol of status was now the anchor of a scandal. My sister, who had always known how to twist attention into armor, found herself exposed. For the first time, she had to explain how she came to possess something that had been paid for with money taken from her sibling's future. Her excuses sounded thin. "I thought they had saved up extra money," she said. "I thought they just wanted to treat me." There was no defensible logic in that. Not when the paper lay there, ordered and precise. My cousin, who had always been blunt, asked what everyone else was thinking. "Did you know?" he said to my parents. His voice held equal parts confusion and anger. My aunt's lips were pursed. My uncle leaned forward, studying the spreadsheet like a prosecutor examining evidence. My father tried to reclaim the narrative, to make it about the holiday spirit, about generosity. But generosity that drains a child's future is not generosity at all. And the distinction was plain now that the math was visible. People began to interpret past behavior through the new context. Little indulgences that once looked like affection now looked like a pattern of enabling and misdirected priorities. I did not revel in their discomfort. I did not clap. The victory I wanted was not the collapse of my parents, but the correction of an injustice. I wanted restitution, a reckoning, an understanding that choices have consequences. Still, as relatives began to murmur their disapproval, as my sister's smile contorted and her voice lost its practiced cadence, a quiet justice unfolded in the room, an inevitable consequence of truth meeting witness. When my father stood abruptly and tried to gather the papers, I reached out and set my hand on the folder, not to stop him physically, but to signal that nothing would be swept away this time. "We'll talk about this calmly," I said, and in the way I said it there was a firmness that no one could ignore. The air was different now. The conversation was no longer about who received which gift. It was about responsibility, about where priorities had been placed, and about the kind of family we were going to be if we didn't address what had happened. The seeds I'd planted with those pages had taken root. That night, the plan did what I had hoped it would. It shifted the scene from private humiliation to public accountability. The documents had stripped the spectacle of its gloss and forced a confrontation that could not be easily dismissed. And that confrontation, calm, factual, and witnessed, was the first true step toward justice. The silence in that living room was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. It wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, like the air itself had turned solid. Every eye was on my parents, on my sister clutching that handbag like a lifeline, and on the papers I'd laid bare on the table. For once, all the whispered doubts and invisible favoritism were visible, undeniable. My father was the first to break. He leaned forward, his voice sharp, trying to slice through the weight of the truth. "This is absurd. You don't understand how these accounts work. You're twisting things." His face was flushed, his tone defensive, but beneath it all was panic. He wasn't protecting me. He wasn't even protecting my sister. He was protecting himself. I met his eyes steadily. "I've worked with those accounts for years. I know what they are, and I know what they're supposed to be used for. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. My words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They landed like hammer strikes in the silence." My mother reached out, her voice trembling. "We just wanted to give her something special. You know how hard she's had it, with her confidence, with school." She trailed off, realizing how flimsy the excuse sounded in the face of hard numbers. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for sympathy, but none came. My sister, usually quick with witty retorts, sat frozen. Her knuckles were white against the leather strap of the Gucci bag. For years, she had basked in attention, untouchable in her parents' eyes. But now, under the scrutiny of relatives and the unblinking clarity of evidence, she looked small. "I didn't know where it came from," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was the first time I'd ever heard her sound afraid. The relatives began murmuring. Not just curiosity now, but anger. My aunt shook her head in disgust. "You took her education money to buy a purse?" she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. My uncle muttered, "Unbelievable." Even the cousins, who normally rolled their eyes at family drama, were shifting uncomfortably, stealing glances at me with a mix of pity and respect. That was the turning point. For years, my parents had been able to control the narrative, to brush aside my feelings as overreactions. But now the narrative was out of their hands. Their downfall wasn't dramatic screaming or throwing of objects. It was the quiet, relentless erosion of authority in front of witnesses who could not unsee what had been revealed. My father tried again, louder this time. "We're the parents. We decide what's best for our children." But the words, once commanding, now rang hollow. No one nodded in agreement. No one defended him. My mother lowered her gaze, shame etched across her features. My sister's eyes darted around the room, desperate for someone to rescue her. But the lifelines she had always relied on had been severed. And then came the cruelest irony of all. The very gift that had been meant to elevate her, to mark her as special, became the symbol of their downfall. That Gucci bag, once a prize, now sat like a trophy of injustice, its gleaming logo reflecting the cold judgment of everyone present. My sister tried to tuck it behind her chair, as though hiding it could erase the truth. But it was too late. The damage was done. That bag was no longer a luxury. It was evidence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The confrontation had reached its peak, and the downfall had already begun. My parents had been stripped of their defense, my sister of her pedestal. They were exposed, cornered by the weight of their own choices, undone by the very favoritism they had wielded so carelessly. And for the first time in my life, I watched them struggle under a burden that had always been mine to carry. Asterisk. The moment of reckoning didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came with stillness, the kind that makes every word ring louder, every silence more condemning. My father's chest heaved as though he were preparing for another argument, but he stopped. My mother, pale and withdrawn, fiddled with the edge of a napkin, her eyes shining with unshed tears. My sister sat rigid, clutching her bag, shrinking under the weight of every gaze in the room. I leaned forward slightly, folding my hands on the table. "This isn't about gifts," I said, my voice even. "This is about trust. You didn't just buy her a handbag. You stole from me to do it, and you expected I'd never notice, never say a word. That time is over." The words settled into the room like stones sinking into deep water. My aunt gave a low murmur of agreement. My cousin muttered, "She's right." It was as if the air itself had shifted. The silent majority of the family who had always watched from the sidelines now stood, at least morally, beside me. I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out the clean, concise summary page I had prepared, the one that listed every account and balance, including the missing sums. I placed it directly in front of my parents. "This is a record of everything. You can argue with me, but you can't argue with the numbers. I'll be keeping copies. If this ever happens again, I won't bring it to this living room. I'll bring it to the lawyer you've been working with for years." My father's face drained of color. For once, he had no quick retort, no booming authority to silence me. My mother reached for the page, her hand trembling, but when her eyes scanned the totals, she recoiled as if burned. My sister tried to speak. "Maybe we can fix this." But the weakness in her voice only underlined how powerless she had become. And that was the payoff. For decades I had been invisible, my voice dismissed, my needs overlooked. But here I was, undeniable, with proof they couldn't erase. The handbag that was supposed to cement my sister's special place had instead exposed their favoritism as theft. Their own arrogance, their own disregard for fairness, had set the trap. All I had to do was open the door and let them walk into it. The final blow wasn't me shouting, or demanding, or taking something by force. It was me standing calmly, gathering my folder, and saying, "I won't let you take anything else from me." The simplicity of it cut deeper than any insult could. My father's mouth opened, then closed. My mother let out a soft, broken sound, and my sister, the one who always seemed untouchable, lowered her head, the Gucci bag suddenly looking more like a weight than a prize in that moment. They weren't powerful. They weren't in control. They were exposed, defeated, and powerless to change it. And for the first time in my life, the room was mine. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, as though the storm had passed but the air was still charged with what it had carried away. My parents didn't call me immediately, and I didn't rush to call them either. For once, I wasn't the one reaching out, trying to smooth things over. I had drawn a boundary, and now it was their turn to sit with it. Word traveled quickly through the family. Relatives who had been present repeated the story to those who hadn't, and soon enough, the narrative was no longer mine to defend. It lived on its own, woven into whispered conversations at dinners and family gatherings. The girl who had always been overlooked had stood her ground, and a week later, my father asked to meet privately. He looked older, diminished, as if the weight of being caught had added years overnight. He didn't apologize in so many words, but he placed an envelope on the table between us. Inside was a cashier's check made out for the exact amount that had been taken from my account, down to the dollar. "It won't happen again," he muttered. His tone was stiff, but the gesture spoke louder than anything else. For my father, it was as close to an admission of guilt as I'd ever get. My mother was more complicated. She called late one evening, her voice soft, almost fragile. "We never meant to hurt you," she said. "We thought we were giving her what she needed." I listened quietly, my fingers tracing the edge of the phone, and then I said, "What I needed was for you to see me. Not just when I was useful, not just when it was convenient." She didn't argue. She only sighed, and I think, in her own way, she understood. As for my sister, the fallout was swift. The Gucci bag, once her crown jewel, became a constant reminder of what had been exposed. Relatives no longer admired it. They looked at it with disdain, as though it carried the weight of stolen value. She stopped bringing it to gatherings, and though she never gave it back, she couldn't wear it with the same pride. Between us, there was no dramatic fight, just a hollow distance that grew wider with time. For the first time in her life, she couldn't look at me without remembering the night the room turned against her. And me? I felt lighter. It wasn't just about the money, though having it restored meant I could finally move forward without that bitter knot in my chest. It was about reclaiming my voice, my dignity, my place in the family. I had spoken, and I had been heard in the months that followed. I invested part of that money into a professional course I'd been eyeing for years. I moved into a new apartment that was small but mine, filled with light and quiet. No constant comparisons, no favoritism echoing through the walls. Every morning, when I sat at the little kitchen table with my coffee, I felt the steady calm of knowing I had stood up for myself and changed the way my story would be told. The new normal wasn't perfect. My relationship with my parents remained strained, and my sister kept her distance. But the balance had shifted. I was no longer the forgotten daughter waiting for scraps of recognition. I had taken back what was mine, and in doing so, I had forced them to see the truth. And that is the moral of it all. When injustice festers in silence, it grows. But the moment you find your voice, even if it shakes, justice has a way of unfolding. Sometimes it doesn't roar. Sometimes it's as simple as sliding a piece of paper across a table and refusing to back down. That Christmas gift, the one meant to make me invisible, became the very thing that made me undeniable. Asterisk.